The Old World battles rage on to determine if the colonization in America will be done under the Catholic or Protestant banner. Let's learn more about this fascinating part of history as told by the Not Just the Tudors podcast.
How is the perceived destabilization of Protestantism in England viewed in the American colonies?
Particularly in England's colonies in North America, especially in New England, the so-called Bible Commonwealths have effectively erected their own quite persecutory regimes, which are basically intolerant of other Protestant groups and non-Protestant groups as well. And policies in North America start forcing through this same policy of religious toleration in the colonies too, with similar kinds of anxieties and opposition arising as a result of that. And so it is generating anxiety, this policy of toleration, not just in England, but also in other parts of the British Isles and also in North America as well.
One can understand concern at the time with meddling in politics, meddling with the Constitution, but I think you're going to help us understand why a policy of toleration towards Catholics felt so invidious at the time, because it sounds fairly common sense right now.
Yes. Well, I think what we have to understand is that sense in which why not tolerate Catholics, or indeed why not tolerate Protestant dissenters, is very much a minority view in the early modern period. And in general, toleration is not seen as a good thing. Toleration is something that you do sometimes because you have to. So, for example, the Edict of Nantes in France is an example of early modern toleration because it's basically, this is a pragmatic measure to stop religious warfare, but it's not saying that Protestant and Catholic coexistence is something that's good in principle. Essentially, the early modern worldview is that if you're Protestant, you believe that Protestantism is the right religion. And if you're a member of the Church of England, you believe the Church of England is the right religion. If you're a Catholic, you believe that's the right religion, and everyone else is believing the wrong thing. And the fact that they believe the wrong thing is not only leading them into a position where they may be damned for all eternity because of these erroneous beliefs, the fact of their existence and preaching these erroneous beliefs, proselytizing these erroneous beliefs, it's kind of like having toxic waste there. It's leaking this error out into the wider world, tempting the conformist into these heterodox positions. So it's something that needs to be suppressed. And there's a general belief at the time that it is legitimate for the civil state to suppress erroneous belief and to punish what is seen as blasphemous or heretical beliefs. Now, the interesting thing about the early modern period is that all the way through Charles II, James II, and then William III, all really want toleration. Historians generally think that both Charles and James were personally committed to toleration. They did believe it was positive, primarily for reasons of state, that this made it easier for them to work with the Catholic powers that they wanted to work with in foreign policy terms, in particular Louis XIV's France. But they also believed that it was something that was good for domestic stability. It was also good for trade. But that remains that kind of minority position, as I've said. And so what they're constantly fighting against, if you like, is the broader intolerance of the society in which they operate in. And that's why it's so difficult, in particular, to get toleration for Catholics. There's possibly a little bit more public support for the idea of limited toleration for some Protestant dissenters, but for Catholics, that's much more beyond the pale of contemporary opinion.
You mentioned the Edict of Nantes, and that had been passed at the end of the 16th century in France to allow that small measure of toleration to Protestants, and it is revoked in France in 1685, in the year that James becomes king. And so we see Huguenot Protestant refugees arriving. How is James's treatment of them, and also how the perceived destabilization of Protestantism in England is viewed in Scotland and in Ireland and the American colonies?
This international picture has to be factored into understanding the anxieties as well. So what's happening in France? There's all sorts of persecution going on in France. That's leading Huguenots to flee to other countries, including to England. From an English Protestant perspective, they're seen as co-religionists who ought to be given shelter. From James's perspective, he is not so keen on them, partly because his relationship with Louis XIV's France, he views that as, in many ways, he's a great admirer of Louis XIV's France, sees him as a great figure to emulate. Also, I think, in terms of James's view on toleration, He does believe in toleration, but he believes in it for those groups that he sees as being peaceable. So he's quite supportive of the Quakers, for example, who by this stage have adopted that principle of pacifism, and for that reason he sees them as not being a threat to the state. But the Huguenots, on the other side, he sees as being more dangerous than this, partly because of their history in France and the history of the wars of religion, but also potentially because of these connections with English dissidents as well. In broader terms, this policy of toleration is problematic in other areas as well. And again, we come back to this idea about these policies of toleration running up against the intolerance of the majority. So particularly in England's colonies in North America, especially in New England, the so-called Bible Commonwealths have effectively erected their own quite persecutory regimes, which are basically intolerant of other Protestant groups and non-Protestant groups as well. And James's policies in North America start forcing through the same policy of religious toleration in the colonies too, with similar kinds of anxieties and opposition arising as a result of that. And so it is generating anxiety, this policy of toleration, not just in England, but also in other parts of the British Isles and also in North America as well.
And I suppose you can think, well, he won't be on the throne forever. This is just a brief aberration, a short interruption in a long line of Protestant monarchs until the birth of a healthy male heir in 1688.
Yes. So this is a real trigger point and one of the things that pushes anxiety into a sense that really action must be taken. So as you say, James is quite old. When he comes to the throne, he's in his 50s. His brother had died in his 50s. Oliver Cromwell had died in his 50s as well. 50 years is quite old in 17th century terms. So there's an anticipation that James may reign for a few years, but then when he dies, he's going to be succeeded by his Protestant daughter Mary, and everything will be fine again. But the birth, unexpectedly, of a healthy male heir in June of 1688 really throws this scenario out the window. And instead, what they're presented with is the possibility of an endless succession of Catholic monarchs. And now connect that with that policy of either, if you see it positively, Catholic emancipation or the restoration of Catholic power in England, this becomes a very, very worrying picture for many English Protestants.
What ultimately then prompts the decision to invite a foreign prince, William of Orange, the husband of James's daughter Mary, to invade?
We need to go back to the strength of the later Stuart monarchy. It has at its disposal an army. James has been building up this army considerably during his reign, and in fact, some recent historical works points out quite a lot of militarization going on in terms of English society and garrisons. There's large meetings of the army on Hounslow Heath. It's all quite threatening. So domestic rebellion seems like it's not going to be a very successful means of challenging James and this threat of Catholic succession. The only opportunity really to potentially overthrow this regime is to look for outside assistance. And William of Orange, another Protestant princeling and the husband of Mary, seems like the obvious candidate. We should also say that this invitation in June of 1688 doesn't come out of the blue. There's long-standing communications going on between William and English politicians, and the invitation itself is really something that's been prompted by William to provide a good pretext for the action that he's then going to take of essentially gathering an invasion force to challenge potentially militarily James's authority. None of these discussions, at least the ones that are written down, explicitly talk about replacing James with William or William and Mary. It's all framed in terms of resisting James's policies, resisting the threat to the church, resisting the threat in particular to what are broadly framed as English laws and liberties.
How is James reacting to this crisis?
Very badly. And partly this is because what is revealed is something that is a conspiracy that is quite deep-seated and goes to his own family as well. So his daughter Anne and his son-in-law are basically on William's side. As events proceed, high-profile members of his army defect over to William's side. Before we get to that point, though, James is trying to sort of row back from his policy. So he does try to undercut the Williamite propaganda that what they're doing, any kind of intervention, will be to preserve English laws and liberties in the English church by moving back from some of these Catholicizing policies. So he restores, for example, the fellows of Magdalen College. The bishops who have petitioned against the Second Declaration of Indulgence are acquitted. So various other kinds of policies are rowing back from them in a bid to sway opinion back on his side. Unfortunately, though, for him, this doesn't really seem to be a very successful strategy. And I think part of the problem is that for English Protestant opinion, they've still got this risk here that James can promise X, Y, and Z, but he's still got this large army on his side. Will he stick to these promises, or will he go back on this again? The possibility of this invasion force from William provides a counterweight to that, I think.
His initial plan is to remain in London to meet William's forces, but he has to alter this. Why?
I think he's concerned about the depths of that particular conspiracy that's going on. He's also increasingly concerned about the volatility of the capital itself. So there's anxiety about hostility to Catholics in London. It's anxiety which encourages him to basically send his wife and his infant son into exile. But he's also going out of London initially with the intent that he's going to meet William's forces on the battlefields.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.